Welcome to the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast on YouTube. My name is Carey Nieuwhof, and my goal is to help you lead like never before. So what I do every week is I sit down with world-class leaders and church leaders, business leaders, and I talk to them about what made them who they are and try to have the conversation with them that you would have if you got to sit down for lunch with them or have dinner with them or really got to spend some time with them. So we go into the backstory and we explore what made them who they are and some of the principles they've learned along the way. So if you enjoy this episode, I would love for you to like it, to subscribe, and also to share it with your friends. And in the meantime, here's today's episode. Lysa, welcome back to the podcast. It's a thrill to have you.
Well, thank you, Carey. It's always an honor to be with you.
Yeah. So 2020 has been a year of trauma for almost everybody. And you got kind of your own trauma, and then we have all the collective trauma. But your last couple of books, you got a brand new one out called Forgiving What You Can't Forget, which I think is an incredible title. But unfortunately, it comes out of a lot of pain. You've been through so much over the last, 3 years, 4 years? For leaders who may not be familiar, can you give them a little bit of a recap of what the last few years have been like for you? Because the interview will make so much more sense when they understand where it's coming from.
Yeah, thank you for asking, Carey. So back in 2016, it was going to be a big year for my family. 3 of my 5 kids were getting married. And in the early part of 2016, I found out my husband was being unfaithful. And it was very shocking, shattering, and disillusioning for me because we were always aware that marriage trauma can happen, but we had done all the things that you think you should do in order to protect your marriage and to keep it in a good place. But I think, the busyness of raising 5 kids and him running a business and me running a ministry, the one thing we did not make time to do was ongoing counseling. I think we reached a place where we just thought, hey, we're good. We really got to spend a season just focusing on the kids. And so we didn't slip into full coasting autopilot mode, but we were not getting intentional counseling with the 2 of us. And so I'm not saying that that's what caused this by any means, but I just know that as I've really taken a hard look at what did we not do, that's something that I want us to do the rest of our lives now. But also, what complicated the situation was that there were some addictions involved. And so when I discovered what was happening in the midst of all of the trauma and emotion and heartbreak, I thought immediately, surely God will weave together a restoration and make this a redemption story. And I didn't want this to be happening, but once I was facing reality, it is happening, then I wanted God to use it for good. But my story was not a neat, tidy, straight line to the good that I assumed God would do. And so things got very complicated and I got very tired. And after 18 months of holding it private, it was very apparent that the story was going to come out. Unfortunately, I'm a public figure. And so I had to make the decision if it was going to come out through the rumor mill or if I needed to get ahead of it and just tell the truth. So that's what I did. And right before I did that, things imploded again. We had about 5 rounds of back and forth where I thought we were about to cross the finish line and, renew our vows and reconcile. And then things blew up again and, other hard things happened, more discoveries were made. And so it was a very long journey, a very devastating journey. And, so when I talk about hurt, I don't talk about it in a neat, tidy Christian packaged up way. I don't want to make this appear easier than what it ever was. It was hard. It was very, very raw. And so for those listening, sometimes when you say we're going to do a podcast on forgiveness, immediately people are crossing their arms, rolling their eyes. And I get it because that word means that you're bringing up the deepest pain that people have experienced often in their whole lives. So I'm not going to be the person giving advice, wagging a finger, trying to make this sound easier than it is. I'm coming at this with my own huge set of resistant statements that seemed like for a long time justified me being able to not forgive.
Well, and I think to compound things, and I think you made that very clear in your last book, but also in this book, that, this wasn't like, discovered, went to a couple counseling sessions, all patched up, everything's fine. It was up and down and around the corner, and it almost fell apart multiple times. And I'm sure in some respects it's still hard. Last time you were on the program, I remember you were setting up at your house for the renewal of vows, which finally happened, I guess. Was that the end of 2018? Was that when that happened?
Yes, it was. Yeah.
I remember.
And it was a day that I'll never forget, because I just remember thinking, this has been the longest journey of hurt and heartbreak. And I did not think it would end in reconciliation. And a lot of stories don't, Yeah. I mean, my mom went through the same thing, and my dad never came home. And Carey, I can't explain why sometimes God rescues people out of relationships and then sometimes provides a way for relationships to be restored. But here's what I do know. No matter what happens in the relationships where you've gotten wounded, whether there's a reconciliation or not, a redemption story is still yours for the choosing, because redemption is between you and God, and no one else's choices can mess that up for you.
Yeah, and I really want to go there, because I think a lot of leaders have forgiveness issues, and I probably do. You don't even realize it, but reading a book like yours, I'm like, oh yeah, there's some layers there. And you think about it. Every time someone leaves your church, every time somebody sent you that angry letter, every time a board member quits, or you lose your job, or someone you were counting on betrays you. Now, in addition to the marriage challenges you had, just real quick, you had a couple of life-threatening health issues happen, and you had the betrayal. I remember you saying, and you hint at it in this book too, the betrayal of a really, really close friend that was just devastating. So
yes,
it was trauma upon trauma upon trauma.
Yeah. So when a marriage implodes, there's never just two people that are affected. It's the shrapnel from that devastation goes out and hits people in different ways. And, you never know what it's going to attach to in their own personal life. Maybe some unhealed trauma in their life, or maybe some fear that they have in their life. So people react in so many different ways. And, we were not just the only two casualties in this. So it wasn't just my marriage falling apart, but it was a lot. It was a lot falling apart. Plus, I had the added, dynamic of public opinion weighing into my very private pain.
Well, you lead Proverbs 31, right?
That's right.
You almost couldn't, if there is an enemy and he was going to wind up and take a shot, it's a pretty key target. I'll just say that. I'm sure that thought's crossed your mind before. But
yeah, absolutely. And so, I went through this season where I was just thinking my life is over, this legacy that I built with my husband. We were so intentional when our kids were growing up. And I remember saying, whenever they would hear about one of their friends' parents separating or getting a divorce, I remember telling my kids, you won't have to worry about that with me and Dad. Your dad and I are both very committed. And so we'll go through a lot as a family, but we're not going to go through that. And then I just thought, how in the world could this be happening? Like, how in the world could this be happening? And it was so hard. And Carey, I'm really honest. I still cry over what happened. Yeah. I say that in the book. There's not a day that goes by that I'm okay with this. It's like if you had a sign-up sheet and it's like, sign up for the trauma that you would go through in your life, I would not sign up for this. I just want to make that really clear, because, I wish that I didn't have this story to tell. And yet I do. And so what do I do about it? Because it's not just something that's affected me and my family. I mean, there are so many people carrying around hurt and devastation. And we live in a world today that is so epically offended over everything.
Yeah, so
it's like
true.
fist slamming fist and hearts hating hearts and division lines and, it's just maddening. And when I think about it, it's like, really, it's not so much that we have different political views and different thoughts on how the problems of the world can be solved. It's really that we all have a lot of unresolved hurt in our heart.
Yep. Yeah.
Because otherwise we could have productive conversations where we agree to disagree. But that's not what's happening right now. There is an epic amount of offended people. And so my prayer is that we cut past the layers of all that people are saying and talking about and, walking around so hurt over, and we really get to people's pain. And that's where I start in this book.
Yeah, you really go there. I mean, by the time you're on page 3, so you don't have to read very far, and you've already raised bitterness, resentment, and trust issues. And I'm reading that going, okay, you've just read the mail of every leader who's ever led for more than 10 minutes. I mean, if you've tried this, and again, I think you're so right. We live in this, and this really concerns me, like the cultural climate we're in right now that is so divided, so hateful. I'm so apprehensive heading into the election, which by the time we're filming this is not, on yet. And yet, I've been married for 30 years. We haven't had your story, but my goodness, we have forgiveness issues in our marriage. Tony has a hard time forgiving me. I have a hard time forgiving her sometimes. Like, we've got this. So you got bitterness, resentment, and trust issues. Can you explain why those factors just keep coming up? Because I'm convinced that there are so many leaders listening to this who are like, I don't know why I'm so angry. I don't know why I'm so frustrated. I don't know why I get so irritated with the staff or with my church or with my family when I get home. But I wonder if that's underneath that.
Yeah. So, Carey, have you ever had one of these situations where it's like, okay, you woke up on a day and you're like feeling fantastic. The birds are singing, the sun is shining, and you're excited about your day. And then all of a sudden, wham, some kind of unexpected criticism comes your way, or some kind of unexpected betrayal comes your way, or somebody quits, or somebody, says something to you or about you on social media, and it is just maddening. It's like it can hijack your emotions, and suddenly,
it is hijacking sometimes.
It
totally
is, right? And suddenly you go from just feeling awesome to feeling so angry and so annoyed, and you just think, how could I have gone from up here to way down here so fast? Yeah. And maybe you even find yourself getting a bit wrapped up in the anger, and maybe you even feel a bit hysterical, not as in it's funny, but as in like, I feel like I'm losing it all of a sudden. Has that ever happened to you?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And used to a lot more. But even now, my mind goes back to a podcast interview we posted a few months ago in the early days of the pandemic. And we just got pilloried for it. And I just remember saying, well, I want to tell that guy, or here's what I want to write. And I'm like, don't do it. But it was an internal battle. Yeah, totally triggered.
So when that happens, I say, and my counselors really taught me this, when we find ourselves getting hysterical, it's historical.
I underlined that. I'm like, I've never heard that. And it's when you're hysterical, it's historical. What do you mean by that? It's so good.
So what I mean by that is, usually it's not just the pain of the present. Usually it's traveling somewhere inside our brain where our trauma experiences are stored, which is in the amygdala of the brain. So it's like we can travel and locate those memories of unhealed, unresolved hurt, that this present offense is tapping into that unresolved hurt from our past, and the two get combined together, and it's just an explosion, because it's not just the story that we're living, it's the story we're telling ourselves. And all those places of unresolved hurt, they form scripts in our mind of our judgments of the world. Like, well, people are just so rude, or nobody ever does what they say they're going to do, or, I bet that guy is just jealous, or, whatever it is. Like, we form all these scripts in our head, and it just ratchets up our emotions. So that's why the Bible makes it so clear that we've got to get to a place where we are dealing with the unhealed hurt in our heart. Carey, when hurt sits unattended in the human heart too long, it turns into all kinds of versions of hate. That's where we get bitterness and simmering resentments and grudges and frustrations. And all of it ratchets up our emotions so quickly when the present person taps into that unhealed pain of our past, and it gets combined, and we have an out of proportion reaction to the offense at hand.
That is, we could just finish right here. Like, there you go. Price of admission paid back many times over. That is such a good thing to figure out. And you mentioned it numerous times throughout the book, and it's a great book. I would strongly recommend. That's going to be my go-to forgiveness book when people ask, because you get those questions. It's like, well, what's a good book on forgiveness? Well, I've got Lewis Smedes wrote a really good one a number of years ago, but this one is quickly my go-to. So you've been going to see a counselor for a long time. So you've been unpacking this. But it's kind of like layers, right? It's not like you have 5 counseling appointments. It's like, all my past is like completely resolved. Is this an ongoing process for leaders? Because guys don't do that as well. I'm just going to make some I do not do that particularly well. It's like I go for a tune-up, then I'm fine, and then I don't know why I'm mad anymore.
Well, thank you for saying what you said about the book, Carey. That's so sweet. And I don't take it lightly. So thank you for that. With saying that you'll make this the go-to book for forgiveness. That's a blessing to my heart.
It's so good.
So in the middle of the book, I have these 3 chapters that really help people do this, because I know some people, either you are too nervous to go to counseling, or you've tried it before and it wasn't a good fit, or you're too busy, or you feel like as a leader, it's like, I don't know, they might recognize me, they might know me, so there's a lot of even resistance to going to see counselors. I'm a big fan of going to see a counselor. So, but my hope is that maybe this book, for those who aren't seeing a counselor, will be a good first step. And then maybe once they take the step and go through some of the exercises in the book, then it'll show them like, oh, wow, maybe I need to continue this journey and go to see a counselor. But in the middle of the book, I have 3 strategic chapters that really can help you deal with some of the unresolved hurts from your past. One that is called collecting the dots. Yeah. The next one is connecting the dots. And then the third one is correcting the dots. Because like I said before, we all have a story that we're living, and then we have the story that we tell ourselves. And we've got to make sure the story we tell ourselves lines up with not only the truth, but the most healed version of who we are. Have you ever heard someone say, I'm just trying to be true to myself? Mm-hmm. And it's like, yeah, I really get that, but we have to make sure that we're being true to the most healed, healthy, whole, and holy version of ourselves. Because if I'm true to my most unhealed self, it can really take me to some bad places.
Yep. No, and that's so good. I mean, I was reading through that thinking, well, first of all, brilliant, collecting, connecting, and correcting the dots. But that's a whole series right there. That could be a book in and of itself. It was just so helpful. And collecting is about your past. Connecting is like, how do all these things shape who I am? And correcting is like, how do I bring that out in light of God's truth? It was a very helpful filter. So there's a lot of advice circulating on forgiveness out there. What's some of the worst, churchy advice or just cultural advice on forgiveness that you've heard?
Well, the title points to one of them. So I did a bunch of focus groups, and one of the number one things people would say is, well, the Bible says forgive and forget. And if I can't forget, then I can't forgive. And it's like, okay, well, actually, the Bible doesn't say that. And, I had to do about 1,000 hours of theological study for this message, Carey, because I had so many misunderstandings about forgiveness. And
Wow.
I really wanted to know, what does the Bible actually say and what does it not say about forgiveness? The Bible does say that God forgives us of our sins and casts them to the depths of the sea and remembers them no more. But the Bible never says people have to forget in order to forgive. Forgive and forget is not a biblical principle. And as a matter of fact, the Bible kind of teaches the opposite. Is, when we remember what's happened to us, use it as a testimony. And Revelation teaches us that the enemy is defeated by the blood of the Lamb and the word of our testimony. So to me, that says, don't forget, just make sure that when you're telling your story, instead of recounting all the proof of how people have hurt you, you're telling a healed testimony when you've traded your proof for perspective, and you're much less focused. You're not focused on what happened. You're much more focused on the wisdom and the life lessons and the perspective that you gained from it that can help other people.
I know we've got to watch time today, so there's so much in there. And in the book, you talk about abuse you suffered as a child. Really, really sad story. Some sexual abuse and other abuse that you suffered as a child. That was part of the collecting the dots, right? Just trying to figure out, why am I this way? Why do I react the way I react? Why do I feel the way I feel? That's an unexplored journey for a lot of people, isn't it? To sort of look back. And I know for me, everybody's story is different, but there were moments at school, there were moments at home where I'm like, oh, that shaped who I was.
Yeah, and sometimes it's the really traumatic things like abuse or sexual abuse. And then other times it's like a moment in time that almost gets burned into our brain that shifts the way we see ourselves and shifts the way we see the world and shifts the way we think about other people. And, those little perspective shifts can affect us so much that at first it starts as like an incident, and then it becomes a perspective, and then it becomes a belief, and then it becomes not only a belief about ourselves, others, and God, but it becomes like this whole way of operating that we carry with ourselves. Like it becomes our processing system.
What was one of those for you? One of those like little beliefs that just shaped you?
So, okay, this is a great story, and I actually didn't get to write about this in the book. So you're going to get some scoop nobody else is getting.
Here comes the scoop, guys.
Here comes the scoop. So I did this activity with my counselor. It's called the trauma egg. I don't know if you've ever seen this, but it's where you get a big piece of white poster board and you divide you draw an egg on it, okay? Like a big egg-shaped circle. And then you divide that up into little compartments. And every compartment, you draw a stick figure picture of a time that you remember from your earliest memory in childhood all the way to present day. And it's any time that you've been abused physically, emotionally, or sexually, or you've been hurt, betrayed, abandoned, or, rejected in some way. And so you draw all those memories with little stick figure pictures in these little compartments. So your egg is made up of, 20, 30, 40 compartments.
Yeah.
Then after you finish, and it's earliest memory all the way to present day memory, whatever you think about, when you think about being hurt, traumatized, whatever. Then I stood in front of my counselor and he just said, tell me the story. And what he was listening for is the shame-filled script that was a belief system that ran like a filter across my brain, that anytime something happened to me, everything was tainted by this shame script. So what was my shame script? And as I told every little story, my counselor picked up on a phrase that I would say often, and he identified that as my shame script. And mine was that I truly am afraid and at times really believe that I cannot inconvenience other people. Otherwise, they will see me as unnecessary, or they'll see me as a pain in their butt. And so I have this fear of being an inconvenience to someone. Now, here's what's interesting, Carey. My husband, Art, did this same activity. And his shame script was, I'm not good enough. So where this dysfunctional dance started to happen in our relationship is Art loves to do things for me. So he would often say, hey, can I do this for you? Or can I do that for you? And I, because I didn't want to be inconvenienced, started telling him, oh no, I'll do it myself, which said to him, he thought I was saying, you're not good enough to do that for me.
Oh my God.
That's not what I was saying. So we were in counseling one day and Art pushed back and he's like, I'm just so tired of you telling me I'm not good enough. And as God is my witness, I've never said that to him. And what our counselor helped us see is that my shame script of being afraid of being an inconvenience and his shame script of not feeling like he's good enough, those two worlds collided. And it created so much damage in our relationship just because of this little belief that we carried all the way from childhood, both of us. And so now when we fixed that, Carey, now I am all the time recognizing what a gift it is for me to ask Art to do something, or when he offers for me to say, yes, I would love for you to do that. And if he ever gets that look in his eye where I can tell something has just pained him, I'll stop him and I'll say, are you hearing in the back of your mind that you're not good enough? Because that's not true. Remember, that's your shame script speaking. And then he'll say to me, Lysa, are you hearing in the back of your mind that you're an inconvenience? Because that's not true. You are loved. And do you see how just fixing that wrong belief, that story that we were telling ourselves, can transform our relationships?
That's so powerful. I haven't really unpacked this yet with Tony, who because we've spent some time together, my wife, but it occurred to me the other day, we just had, it wasn't a big meltdown or anything, but we've realized, like with the love languages, acts of service is one of the things I really appreciate, and I will do something for Tony, but it doesn't have the same impact on her that it would for me. And hers is quality time. So it's interesting, and that's low on my list. I'm like, just do something, okay? So what's really interesting, it occurred to me that her bidding for quality time, I will often say, oh yeah, but we better clean the kitchen first, or let me cut the lawn first. And I'm saying, I don't value you. And then when she's like, no, let's just sit down and relax. I'm like, no, you don't value me, because if you really did, you would tidy up the kitchen, or you would, get this taken care of. And I just realized, of course, the enemy's going to play out a perfect script of that kind of thing. And I think surfacing those issues can be really helpful. Not the same as yours. The shame script is fascinating. I have no idea what my shame script is, but I know there probably is one. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. That's
You're
so
welcome.
helpful. Did that resonate? The acts of service versus quality time. It's just.
Oh, absolutely. And,
Yeah.
I think because we are all the time bringing this kind of unspoken contract into every relationship that we have, it can be very easy to start to have expectations of one another, and yet we don't really communicate those expectations. But what my counselor has helped me understand is expectations are really premeditated resentments. In other words, if I expect that our contract is going to go this way, that you're going to give me lots of quality time, and you're expecting the contract to be, okay, acts of service are what's most important. You see how those two things bump into one another.
Totally.
And so what I teach in the book, and this is one of my favorite parts of the whole book, is that if we go all the way back to Adam and Eve, and we look at the fact that Adam was created from something that seemed so insignificant, from the dust of the earth. And Eve was created by something that really we would think needs to be buried and forgotten, broken off bone, right? But we're not just dust, and we're not just broken off bone. We are breath of God and touch and design of God. And so if I can remember to look at my husband with all his faults and all his, uniqueness and all his amazing qualities and then some aggravating qualities too. But if I can look at him and I can say, hey, Art, I just want you to know that I recognize you're not just a sum total of human qualities. You're not just dust. You are breath of God, intentionally created by God to represent the goodness and the glory of God and to spread that throughout all of the world. And so, yes, babe, you've had a bad day. And yes, you shouldn't have said that to me. Or, yeah, that probably wasn't the best decision to make. But I want you to know I see beyond all of that. And I know you're more than a sum total of your actions and reactions. And then for him to say back to me, and Lysa, you are not just broken off bone. You are touch and design intentionally made by God Almighty to be who you are. And it's great. So can you imagine just changing even the scripts inside of our marriage this way? What we can have the opportunity to do. So see, my book isn't just about forgiveness. It's really about using this incredible gift that God has given us, forgiveness, to sweep our heart clean so we can start to see something so much bigger and so much more beautiful than people's faults and inadequacies and offenses and grudges and simmering resentments. Yes, we've got to deal with all of that, but it's so that we can start to see and experience beautiful again, beautiful in our lives, beautiful in our relationships. And that's what I'm really going after here.
No, it comes through loud and clear. And, one of the misconceptions I held on to for years around forgiveness is this idea that forgiveness really happens if, I offend you, I finally come back to you, say, I'm sorry, we're restored. Is it possible? Because this happens all the time in leadership where people who hurt you, people who betray you, people who wound you, offend you, and sometimes you take offense, but sometimes no, there's a real thing there. They never ask for forgiveness. Is it possible to forgive somebody who doesn't want forgiveness or doesn't seek it?
Such a good question. So yeah, when I was a little girl, the way I thought that forgiveness worked, the way I was taught that forgiveness worked is that usually it would be between me and my sister, and we'd get into a little argument, and then I would push my sister and she would cry. And then my mom, the great judge, would appear and she would say, you are wrong and you were right and you need to say you're sorry and you need to say you forgive. And then the two of you need to hug and make up. And if you don't stop acting foolish, I'm really going to give you something to cry about.
Yep.
And so I carried that very little girl understanding of forgiveness into some very adult situations. And I never allowed my vision for forgiveness, my understanding of forgiveness, to grow up and mature into where it really needs to be. And a mature version of forgiveness and an understanding of forgiveness is when we finally realize we can't wait for someone else to make a choice to make any of this right. If we are waiting for someone else to say they're sorry, own what they did, suffer the way we've suffered, make it right, admit what they did was epically wrong. If we are waiting for that to happen, then what we're saying is, I can't heal until they make a different choice. Mm-hmm. And so a mature version of forgiveness is when we decide that we ourselves have suffered enough because of what other people have done to us. So we're going to unhitch our ability to heal from their choices. And we're going to say, I get to make the decision to sever the source of suffering in my life. And I am making this decision to forgive so that I can heal. And I have carried the weight of the suffering and unforgiveness way too long. And that, Carey, is when we really can understand that we don't have to have that epic moment with that other person. We can choose to forgive because forgiveness is the way we keep our hearts swept clean.
See, that's so liberating. And I like the phrasing of it, mature, because in the most extreme case, somebody that maybe you still haven't forgiven is dead. They're never going to come back, right? They died a few years ago, or they're not a safe person. Like we'll talk about boundaries hopefully before we're done, but you shouldn't approach them. Or they're not repentant, or they're unaware, or they've lost their mental capacity to really have a conversation with you about it, And
or they don't care,
or they don't care, right?
Yeah.
Let's just be really honest. They're just indifferent. It's like, whatever. So you would say in those situations, and I think this is like a lot of leadership, a lot of life. It's like, no, forgiveness is something you should embrace so that the past doesn't own you or the hurt doesn't own you.
That's right. And, Carey, I always encourage people too who have been deeply hurt by another person. You don't have to start with forgiveness. That's a really hard place to start. So instead, let's start with your pain. Let's just acknowledge the pain that you've been through. Because if we skip this step, you can feel like forgiveness is saying your pain doesn't matter, or what happened really didn't affect you.
Right.
And it very much affected you, and it very much matters. And I guess I want to say to any listener right now who's crossing their arms and just saying, you don't know how bad I was hurt. I have to say, you're right. I don't know your story. I wish I did. I wish we were sitting across the table having coffee with one another right now. But I do want to say to you, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for what happened to you. I really am. And I want to say I believe you. Like, your pain is real, and it's deep, and it's hard, and you shouldn't have been hurt the way you were hurt. And if no one else in this world has ever dared to bear witness to your pain, I will. And I'm sorry for what they did. I'm sorry for what they didn't do. And I'm sorry that you're living with this. But friend, you really do deserve to stop suffering because of what another person has done to you. So start there. Start with your pain.
Wow.
And write it down. Like, I took 3x5 cards and I wrote down all the different ways that I've been hurt. And that is how we can get that out. And then I just went by card by card by card by card. And I just said, I forgive you for this pain that happened, for this fact of what happened. And then I added this little statement, and whatever my feelings will not yet allow for, the blood of Jesus will surely cover it.
Wow. Yeah.
And the reason I added that is because hurt feelings don't often want to cooperate with holy instruction. And so I had a wrong view of forgiveness. I thought forgiveness was me like bossing my feelings around or overriding my feelings or just trying to conjure up enough spiritual maturity to grit my teeth and in my own determination just eke out, I forgive you, right? But forgiveness is not based on my determination. Forgiveness is based on my cooperation with what God has already done through the blood of Jesus. Yeah. And as God's forgiveness flows to me, it can then flow through me. And I just cooperate with the flow of forgiveness that's coming from God. And that's what I then give to other people. And it's a beautiful process. It's not easy, but it is possible.
That's so helpful, Lysa. In the book, and I'm so glad you went there, you talk about, I think this is a quote, forgiveness is more satisfying than revenge. Maybe it's my personality type. I sometimes think about revenge, like usually with my words, well, I'll go in there and I'll set this straight and somebody's going to pay. And, over time I've kind of learned, well, that almost never goes the way you think it's going to go. And even if it does, it's not very satisfying. How is forgiveness more satisfying than revenge?
Well, when I wrote that, I had to sit with it for a little while. And I had to really challenge myself. Like, is it? Because I don't know. Sometimes revenge feels like it'd be pretty satisfying.
Yeah, it feels pretty fair. Yeah, let's be honest.
And like, I have the curse of comeback. So it feels like it might feel really good to just say that thing, to cut that other person down to the quick and prove how wrong they are and right the scales of justice, right? But at some point, I started saying this to my kids, and then God started saying it to me. Has that ever happened to you?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Sometimes my kids or wife have quoted back to me something I said. It's like, stop quoting that guy. It's terrible.
I know. But this is what I often will say to my kids. Like, you got to trade all that for an upgrade. You got to trade all that drama for an upgrade in your life. Like, do you really want to jump into the cesspool? Because that revenge, it'll feel good for about 2 seconds. But what revenge really is it's you signing up to get hit and hurt twice by that person's offense. Like, you've already been hurt by what they did to you. So don't hurt yourself by now participating in more emotional trauma of the action of revenge. It just continues a vicious cycle that'll never end. You got to trade all that drama for an upgrade. And Carey, let me ask you something.
Yeah.
So when you sin, now I'm not saying you have to confess, but let's say you do something wrong, you sin, you hurt somebody. Do you ever find that the consequences for that sin are sort of already built in? Like, at some point, you're going to suffer for that sin that you created. Oh, yeah. Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
You know what? A couple months ago, I sent an email I shouldn't have sent when I was really upset. I still am untangling the damage from that. Yep.
Yeah. So we know that when we do something wrong, that we suffer the consequences for it. It's built into that wrongdoing. Right. We forget when it comes to other people that the same is true for them. So I'm going to let that sit on you for just a second. You see, we know it for ourselves, but we assume because we see that other person smiling, laughing on Instagram,
they're not.
We think they got off scot-free, and they don't. Sin comes as a package deal of consequences. When that person sinned, they unleashed consequences they probably didn't even realize they were unleashing. I think that's why the Bible says pray for your enemies, because they are going to suffer the consequences of their actions. It's built in. And you don't have to see how they're suffering to know that they are suffering. So what God says is, revenge is mine. Like God says, I will avenge, not revenge, but I will avenge this situation. So you take that person and you place them in God's hand, because God sees the consequences they've already unleashed in their life. So only God can address this in equal measures of justice and mercy. And so we place them in God's hands, and we say, I don't have to see it to know that God is addressing it. And I can trust this. This is the best form of justice, right? Is us deciding we're not going to take this on, because to do so is going to cause more and more and more emotional hurt in our own lives. And there's just been enough hurt. So we decide, you know what? I am not willingly signing up for anything more. I've suffered enough from this. And Carey, another thing that I will often say to my kids is, you don't have to attend every drama you're invited to.
Wow. Your 1,000 hours of study really showing off. I mean, this is incredibly deep and really, really helpful and penetrating. Not only a reread, but also a re-listen. So this is good, because I'm thinking about one person in particular. I'm pretty good at forgiving, I think. But there's one in particular, and I'm like, yeah, I've suffered way more than he has in all the drama I play out in my mind. Not in real life, but this is so good. Let's talk about boundaries before we wrap up, because you've got a whole section on boundaries in the book. So this doesn't mean, and you're very good at pointing this out, that we're all just hugs, reconciliation. Like, forgiveness is very different than reconciliation. It's very different than restoration. And you may have to have some boundaries in place, or you will have to with certain individuals. Can you just touch on that?
Yeah. So first of all, I want to say, let's talk about what a boundary is and what it is not. Sure. So a boundary is not meant to shove the other person away. It's meant to hold us together, like holding me together. And so I know how I want to act and react, but sometimes people trigger me or push my buttons to the point where I'm not able to hold it together. So my boundaries help hold me together, right?
Oh, that's a fresh take. That's good.
Yeah. And also, a boundary is not meant to control or manipulate another person. But that is often what somebody who you try to draw a boundary with, they'll often say, you're trying to control me, you're trying to manipulate me, or you're being so unforgiving. So we have to make sure that we understand that's not what's happening here. It's often the people who resist having a boundary put into a relationship the most that truly need that boundary. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So it's often the people that need boundaries the most that refuse to cooperate with them, you know? And so I think that's an important point too. So if you have somebody saying, like, if you put up a boundary, and let's just give an example of what is a boundary. Okay, so a boundary to hold me together, one of the boundaries that I had to do with my kids is I had to say, I can have conversations with you all day long. Like, I am happy to talk with you all day long. But at 9 p.m., I am no longer willing to engage in conversation, because this is not good theology, but it's absolutely true for me. The Holy Spirit leaves my body at 9 p.m. every night. Okay? So enter in at your own risk. And I just know, in other words, I know that's not theologically sound, but what I'm saying to them is, like, I know I cannot bring my best self into a conversation past 9 p.m. So my boundary is, in order for me to hold myself together, my boundary is that I am happy to have conversations. I want to have conversations, but they need to start so that they can end by 9 p.m. because after that, I'm no good. And I've made that decision for myself. I'm not trying to push you away. I'm not trying to control you or manipulate you. I'm telling you how I need to function and operate at my best. And that's what I need, right? And so that's an example of a boundary. Another example of a boundary is maybe you have somebody in your life, every time you get on the phone, they want to bash other people.
Yep.
So you can establish a boundary. Like, you don't have to be victim to their chaos, right? You can establish a boundary and just say, hey, Carey, I really enjoy talking to you, but I have to say, I've established for myself, I am no longer willing to participate in conversations that, bash other people. And so if that is what you start doing on the phone call, I'm going to have to say, hey, Carey, I think you need to reserve this conversation for someone else, or better yet, in your prayer time. But I can't participate in this because it's just something I've decided for myself I'm not willing to do. Then you have the right, Carey, to decide if you're willing to continue in the conversation with me, to respect my boundary or not. But if you don't, then I'm going to have to put another boundary up. You see what I'm saying?
Man, that's so healthy.
Yeah. And I think people get very paralyzed in relationships thinking, I just have to go along with whatever the other person lays down. And I'm like, no, you don't. No, you don't. You are responsible for you. And so no one else is going to be able to take care of you as best as you are. So you've got to do some self-care, some soul care here of determining what is and is not acceptable to you, what is and is not permitted with you, what is and is not healthy for you. And you get to make that decision. And I know it's a lot easier to talk about than it is to actually live it out in everyday life. But once you start to understand, it's actually a gift to the relationship. It's not a detriment to the relationship. I think you'll start to feel a lot safer in your relationships.
Well, and often that other person, if they're relatively healthy, picks up on those clues and goes, maybe I should throw people under the bus a little bit less. And I've seen that dynamic play out as well. Okay. I got to ask you this because you have a lot of content creators. So final question, this could be a 3-hour episode. It's so good. But final question, because we all have to do this. And you have done it masterfully in your books, but the last two in particular, and this one I feel even another layer of rawness and vulnerability there. But how do you write about your pain in the middle of your pain?
Good question, Carey. I think for me, I'm always trying to make sure that I've allowed enough healing to happen so that I'm not just putting my pain on paper for the sake of writing another book. And so I have to make sure that I'm not trying to prove how right I am in my book, but instead I'm trying to excavate the life lessons and the perspective shifts that I've made so that it really can help other people when they're in that pain. So I think it's a timing thing. We really do have to experience some healing before we can help other people heal. And I think that's important. But I also think it's important for us to remember there's a big difference between secrecy and privacy. Secrecy is us hiding from other people things that are making us more and more unhealthy. Privacy is withholding some details for the purpose of healing. So if you notice in my book, I am very vulnerable about the big picture of what we walk through, but I share very few
there's
details.
Almost, if you're hunting for details on a gossip level, there's nothing there. And I think that's very appropriate. It respects your relationship and it respects you and your marriage.
Yeah. And details I've found just satisfy people's curiosity, but they get so full of consuming the details that they have no room for then consuming the experiential wisdom, which is what will really help them transfer the life lessons from my life to their life. And I think that's the more important thing. So when I'm in pain and I'm writing, I try to make sure that I've healed enough, but I also try to make sure that I hold private details that aren't necessary. But what's more important is to unpack the emotional fallout that people can relate to and learn from and experience the depth of the emotion so they trust that I've hurt just like they've hurt, so they know that this experiential wisdom could possibly work for them as well.
Lysa, I want to thank you so much for your time today. And I just want to say I've learned so much from you. Had the privilege of taking your Compel training. I think we talked about that before on an episode. It's so good for those of us who produce content. It's really challenging, particularly as a guy. I just find you're so good at vulnerability and it's so easy. I think last time you were on, we talked about the different voices. It's so easy for me to become the teacher. It's like, oh yeah, I used to struggle with, but now look, I got it all together. And you're just so good at keeping it honest, and writing out of the constant journey that is life. And you've done that with this book. We'll link to everything in the show notes. If people want to learn more, where can they find more, Lysa?
Yeah, so you can go to forgivingwhatyoucan'tforget.com. And that's the book website, and they can, find all the information, the trailers, all that kind of stuff right there on that website. And of course, you can check me out on social media. Instagram is one of my favorite places to communicate with people, at Lysa TerKeurst. And my name's kind of complicated, Lysat, and hopefully you'll find me.
Okay, that's awesome. Lysa, once again, thank you. I really appreciate you. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Thanks, Carey.
Well, I hope today's episode was helpful to you. You can always get more by subscribing to my channel. I also have a lot more content over at CareyNieuwhof.com for leaders in business and leaders in churches. And you can get transcripts of this episode there and so much more, plus some other stuff I do for leaders. So head on over there to discover more at CareyNieuwhof.com. And in the meantime, I really hope our time together today has helped you lead like never before.